We'll give it a minute.
Sounds good. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Professor Wong. Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you
Hi,
for
Philip.
arranging this. Hey, Jason. Good to see you.
Yeah, I'll be a stern for beginning of May. Hopefully, see you again.
Yeah, happy to see you. Yeah, I'll be there.
I think I'm the only one calling from campus, so it's nice and dark outside.
Mhm.
It's also pretty early for Philip too. It's like what, 5 o'clock a.m.
Fortunately, I'm not on campus. I
Oh,
am. I'm currently in Hong Kong, so
oh, that's good. Yeah,
evening for
good
me.
for you.
Don't let the background deceive you.
Yeah, that's right. Don't let the background deceive you.
Shall we begin? I think it's been a minute.
Sounds good. Should we just start?
Yeah, I think you can start, Dinshaw, since you are the moderator
Okay.
for this. Yeah, sure.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you all for joining us. Today's panel is about Taiwan-India economic relations, with a special focus on advanced manufacturing and semiconductors. Joining me today, we've got Dr. Philip Wong, the Willard R. and Inez Kerr Bell Professor at the School of Engineering here at Stanford. We've got also Jason Su, Mason Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School and a former legislator from Taiwan, and Konark Bandari, a fellow at Carnegie, India. The purpose of this panel today is to broadly explore Taiwan-India relations, but more specifically, really to drill down into cooperation between the two countries over semiconductors and advanced manufacturing. This is a really exciting time for this area, as many of the guests who are joining us probably know. Semiconductors have become the main focus for a lot of countries in terms of their industrial policy, and India is no exception. Taiwan is the world's leader in semiconductor production, and while India recognized the potential of semiconductors as an important industry early on in the mid-1960s, actually, they were working on it. It really hasn't gotten its act together. It's struggled for basically the bulk of that time. And it's tried all kinds of different things. Governments offered subsidies to various industries multiple times, both domestic and foreign. There's a lot of hope, however, today that the recipe is right, that the mix of corporations that are looking at India, that the geopolitics that are going along, where countries are trying to diversify from China and just diversify their supply chains more generally, that the level of Indian expertise has brought India to a point where it can attract some supply chains. Taiwan, being the world leader in this space, would have to be a partner for that sort of realization to happen. So just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Our panelists, please raise your hands and mute yourselves as appropriate. For our guests, there's a Q&A box below. You can write in your questions there. This discussion is being recorded and streamed on our platform, on the Carnegie India platform. And so anything you write, if I choose it as a question, it's going to be there and it will be attributed. So just be aware of that. The layout for this function today, we're going to spend the first 5 to 7 minutes. We're going to give each panelist a chance to speak and lay out their views. And then we'll do a moderated discussion from there before we take some questions from the audience. So with that, I'll go in order. Dr. Wong, Professor Wong, would you like to start us off, please, with a few remarks?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation to join this very interesting panel, and really a pleasure to be here. The questions that was raised is about technology, in particular, perhaps semiconductor technology in relation to Taiwan and India. Perhaps I could start with some observation about the semiconductor industry in Taiwan, and perhaps that could serve as a backdrop for thinking about where and how India could kind of bootstrap itself and get ahead in this business. The semiconductor industry in Taiwan started more than 30 years ago, close to 40 years now, starting from basically manufacturing technologies that were already developed by developed countries such as the U.S. and helped by companies in Europe and U.S. and bringing technologies into Taiwan. And Taiwan sent their engineers to learn these technologies and bring it back to the home country and grow the industry that way. Now, over time, they were able to upgrade their technology over the course of 20, 30 years, upgraded technology from basically copying what others have already developed to developing their own technology. In the beginning, there was more a kind of like a fast second, namely being the second company to get to the latest technology and hopefully fast enough to capture enough of the profit margin from the leading edge technology to by now they have caught up with the rest of the world and are able to produce the most advanced leading node technology. Now, that, of course, there's a time element in it that over time they were able to do that. If I think about how one could attribute the success, eventual success after 30-some years, I guess there are three things that is the key elements. One, of course, is the insight from the government to invest in this particular industry, not only the investing in the semiconductor industry itself, but also up and down the supply chain, the suppliers, the materials and equipment suppliers, and also associated technologies, as well as the downstream, the designers, companies that use those technologies, those semiconductor technologies, and design products out of it. So it's really a whole ecosystem that the government has invested in it. That's the first one. The second one, which is important to recognize, is that it has recognized a shift in the whole industry. The shift being that the split between fabless and design houses and a new business based on foundry that serves everybody in terms of the taping out chips and design and offering it to customers who make a business out of designing chips for systems. So this shift in technology, or not just in technology, but also a shift in the business model is a key element in which the industry in Taiwan and the government have recognized and while the rest of the world was not paying attention at the beginning. So that shift in technology and the way technology is being produced is another elements that lead to what it is today. The third one, the third elements, which is probably the most important one, is the availability of talent. Back in the 60s and 70s, and for the better parts of 80s and 90s, and even to early 2000s, many highly talented Taiwanese graduates from universities went to Europe and the US, Japan, and so on to learn about new technology and get educated. And many of them stayed in those countries and gain industrial experience. And those form a very formidable cadre of talented engineers who are available for the local Taiwan industry to tap into and attract them back into their home country. Oftentimes, they are attracted not only by the career opportunities, but also attracted by the fact that they could be home with the families and friends and so on. And that is both the career opportunity because it's a growing industry, and the kind of homecoming opportunity become a big attractor for local Taiwanese semiconductor companies to attract highly talented people who have been trained and gain experience. So these three factors are really important to recognize that contribute to the Taiwan semiconductor industry in the way that it has in the past few decades, and becoming today the formidable force that it is today. So if you think about in this day and age, we may need to think about what are the ingredients that may lead to success. Of course, government support is important. Then the next question is in what form, shape and form this government support should be. And second is about the changing in the business model. The question to ask is, are there changes in the technology today that would be analogous to what it was maybe 30 years, some years ago? Are there changes and are there disruptions in the technology and the way businesses are being conducted in the semiconductor world that one could capitalize on? That's the next question. And finally, how do we capitalize on the talent? And if I think about India, in Silicon Valley, for example, there are many expatriates from India, originally from India, that are holding key positions in the semiconductor industry and, broadly speaking, the IT industry. The question is, how would India be able to attract these people back to India? Because these are highly skilled, and if you look at key companies in the tech businesses, many are actually headed by CEOs who are originally from India. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. So if you think about these three things, maybe we could use it to think about how a country like India would have a unique opportunity going forward.
Great, thank you so much for those introductory comments. I'd like to turn now to Jason, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to share the panel with my good friend, Professor Philip Wang. And obviously, Taiwan has been the forefront, a leader in the semiconductor industry, and the success of this sector is not built overnight, while the rest of the world is now thinking how could they replicate Taiwan's success by creating industrial policy to attract foundries or TSMC to set up fabs to their countries. Very few of this endeavor have been materialized. And I wanted to lay out a few reasons why and what can be done with respect to India's positioning and strategy. Dr. Wang has already shared about the industry's past success formula and how Taiwan come about for the last 3 decades by attracting talent, setting up industrial policy, and also creating an ecosystem that will nurture the development of this industry. And today's result is really um, a result of a 30 years work. So one cannot discount the past failure or setbacks or all the experiences that lead to today's success. So as for countries that have been endeavor to create semiconductor industries, there are a few things that the policymakers or government or even industry experts must pay attention to. Number one is the strategy. Not every country should do a fab, even though every country wants to have a TSMC or have some sort of fab in their own territory. However, it would defeat the purpose for every country to set up a fab or to ask TSMC to open a factory there. The very reason why today's semiconductor industry is so successful is because it's seamless integration of supply chain in Asia, or I should say in Taiwan. And to be able to break that supply chain ecosystem and to disperse it all over the world, it's an antithesis to its success formula. So to ask TSMC to open fab in every continent would be very much a unrealistic idea. So in terms of a strategy, countries should think in the entire semiconductors ecosystem. There's IC design, so-called fabless. There's foundry. There's packaging. There's also IP or the architecture layer of the businesses. What segment do you want to develop? For example, NVIDIA and AMD are a so-called fabless companies. They don't own a fab, but they design chips and outsource the chips to TSMC. So number one priority you need to decide is where and what segment do you want to go into the entire value chain. In my opinion, the success formula in Taiwan will be very hard to duplicate. We see a recent opening of TSMC's fab in Kumamoto in Japan. It was started slower later than the project in Arizona, but it finishes quicker than Arizona. The reason why is because Japanese and Taiwanese work ethics and work culture share similarities. And it would also take a similar type of management style and discipline to be able to work at the same efficiency and effectiveness and excellence that a semiconductor fab would require. And secondly is second important point is the resources. To build a fab is not only a very expensive endeavor. It costs tens of billions of dollars to build a fab. And if you don't have a long-term plan to sustain its operation or to develop the ecosystem or the type of market demand for it, I dare to say it would be a very quick failure. For example, Arizona's fab in TSMC's building, reportedly it will cost $40 billion, or TSMC is investing $40 billion to build two fabs, and tens of billions of dollars already been invested, but we haven't seen a very substantive result. So whether government support can be ongoing and long-standing is a question that countries must ask themselves. TSMC has had a very consistent support from the government, regardless of political ideologies. All political parties support semiconductor as its industry. And thirdly is talent. Today's semiconductor is a highly sophisticated and intellectually concentrated manufacturing business, and it requires a very sophisticated training for master's degree and PhD degrees, and it also requires those who study in this field to have the determination to work in this field. I've chatted with Dr. Philip Wang, who shared with me that to train a student who is able to work in a fab capably would take 10 to 12 years, meaning that going the day he decided to study electric engineering or other related field to the day he graduated and get his PhD. And so in today's world, whether that would be the route that your students will pursue and will have continuous supply of students that study in this field, I think there would be a lot of questions for the policymakers to think through. So the most important part, obviously, is the talent. If we build a fab, but no one is able to run it or operate or to make the chips, the fab becomes an empty shell. And so we must think hard and about this is not just money you put in, but also you have to have other components in place in order for this to work. So I will stop here. I will say that countries today are very passionate and anxious to develop their semiconductor industry, but they must first of all figure out their strategy, their positioning, and their resources. There is no need to compete in the same field that other countries have already done so well, and you will take years, if not decades, to catch up. Even I'm questionable about US's exercise in onshoring the semiconductor chips, because if you think about the 3 or 4 conditions I lay out, it simply doesn't add up. They may have the money, but whether they will have a continuous supply of the money if a new administration comes up, I think that's also a question to be answered. So
I think we're hearing some similar logics here. First, in Professor Wang explaining how Taiwan made its positioning and what India should be thinking about, as well as with what Mr. Su has said, what Jason has said about the need for regular support, a talented and motivated workforce, as well as identifying the opportunities, the challenges in the existing technology that India could potentially capitalize on, how it should strategize itself as it enters this space. Let's turn to our panelists from India. Konark, would you like to take the floor, please?
Sure, thank you. I think those are some excellent opening remarks which really framed the entire issue really well. How did Taiwan sort of, start incubating its domestic semiconductor industry, which is now global in nature, and also what are the pitfalls which we must be wary of as India starts to think about building an ecosystem in India as well. I'll just keep my remarks a bit brief, but also sort of take a more zoomed out view, a more of a macro view. I think this is a timely discussion which needs to be had, certainly, as India seeks to shore up its hardware sector through Make in India and the PLI scheme, which is the Production Linked Incentive Scheme. There's also now a plan of various manufacturing companies to go with the China Plus One plan. And I think so it's a very topical discussion to look at how has India's efforts in this area paid off in the last couple of years, and how have the global value chains responded to India's policies. So for India, this is clearly a major issue. For the longest time, India has relied on the services sector, which contributes around 60%, to the gross value added in terms of the entire GDP. But in terms of employment, its contribution is around 30% or lesser. So the question becomes, how do we sort of have a more labor-intensive approach to creating value, and that's where manufacturing comes in. Uh, in addition to that, India has a burgeoning import bill, in terms of semiconductors and also electronics as well, which India would want to rectify. Lastly, the significance of semiconductors has become quite apparent because they've become a really critical technology, be it defense uh, items or be it even things like automobiles as well. So I'll keep it brief, but essentially, my focus here is going to be talking about India's schemes in the last couple of years, with a major focus on the PLI scheme, or the Production Linked Incentive Scheme, and the Make in India scheme. So the PLI scheme is essentially a production linked incentive scheme which the government has brought out for various sectors, 14 sectors essentially, ranging from electric vehicles to mobile phones to food products to even pharmaceuticals. And the total amount which is being given out in terms of incentive is around $25 billion. So the scheme essentially pays a manufacturer a sum. So that's around 6 to 7% of the sale price. So suppose if a company was to start scaling up their operations in India, they already manufacture around 100 million, say, phones in India, and they were to ramp up that capacity by, say, 10%, then the Indian government would essentially pay them 7%, of the sales made on this additional 10 million units. So that's essentially what the PLI scheme is. Now, the problem is that there is still a debate going on in India if the PLI scheme is actually, paid off. Um, so the rationale behind the PLI scheme was that India manufactures so little. There are various issues which come up in India, which anybody faces when it comes to manufacturing, be it power issues, be it skill issues, the high cost of finance, infrastructure issues. So it was basically meant to get the global companies which have scale, which have a large consumer base, and which can basically, serve the Indian market and also use the Indian market as a base to export to come to India. The problem is that there's not much agreement in terms of the overall value which has been added by the PLI scheme. Some people feel that, it's not very clear what the exact value added here is. Yes, the exports have gone up to the point now where India is now exporting around $11 billion worth of mobile phones, smartphones this year. But again, the question here is not necessarily the value of the export. Some people say that what's essentially happening here is a lot of smartphone companies are essentially, due to high tariffs in India, importing it, serving the domestic market, and assembling the pieces here. So there's not much manufacturing happening here. What's really happening here is the assembly of these pieces into mobile phones, and that's not really manufacturing or really Make in India. The Make in India scheme also, something which was brought up by the Prime Minister around 10 years back, is something which was, meant to incentivize manufacturing in India. But again, like the PLI scheme, the Make in India scheme has also been sort of critiqued, uh, you know, uh, basically talking about that the share of manufacturing in the gross value added has remained constant since the scheme was introduced. So there's not been much change in terms of the percentage share of manufacturing. The investments in manufacturing in India have basically remained constant. They've not really gone up substantially. And the employment in manufacturing, which is the entire purpose of the Make in India scheme, has actually fallen by around 1.5 crore, or which is around 15 million uh, individuals in the workforce. So clearly, the debate has not really, reached a very definitive conclusion as to how have these schemes fared. But I think it's important for Taiwanese firms to think about how would they approach the PLI scheme, how would they approach the Make in India scheme, if India has to see any progress when it comes to onshoring Taiwanese companies like TSMC, like PSMC, or any others to India. So I'll keep it there for now.
Thank you very much. This has been very helpful with the color on India. I think I'd like to start just by asking a question. Both countries have been experimenting with subsidies, government support for the industry. In one case, Taiwan has had a lot of success with that. as both Professor Wong and Mr. Su has said, it was the basis for the industry starting. It wasn't the only factor, but it was a necessary factor. As Konark has mentioned, India has also been working in this space with much less results to show for it. I'm just wondering, Professor Wong and Mr. Su, maybe you would like to start us off just by saying, you both mentioned it's not just about the money. There's a shape and a form that also has to come with this. What was the early stage subsidy? What was the kind of government support that was coming in? Maybe that will help us understand why money alone doesn't solve these kinds of problems. What was the environment like in Taiwan for this sort of stuff? Professor Wong, would you like to go back? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I'll start and Jason would chime in. I'll start by looking at what is needed from a technology point of view, from an engineering point of view. I don't know anything about government policies and things like that. And Jason is an expert on that. From a technology point of view, the government support that is important is the creation of the science parks in Taiwan. And the science park basically is the government provided the land and all the infrastructure surrounding the science park. And the existence of a science park is important because then you would be able to co-locate many companies within the ecosystem in the same physical space, very closely tied together in the same physical space. That has several important ramifications because the development of systems or products are not just the engineering effort of a single company, but rather it needs many different companies to work together. The upstream suppliers, the downstream customers, the users of the technology, and so on. So a science park is able to co-locate many of these companies together. I think that is a very important piece of the success.
Thank you.
Yeah, in the earlier days of the semiconductor development in Taiwan, our government have used the country's government fund to jumpstart their first investment into this industry, hence created TSMC and also later on spin-off from eTree, our national R&D lab, several other companies in the ecosystem. We realized that number one, we need to attract talent back from the US. So we make very deliberate efforts to recruit people like Dr. Morris Zhang and others to return to Taiwan to help start this company. And we also sent a group of engineers from Taiwan to the US to be trained. And when they return, they all work in this field. And many of them in the later days also founded their own semiconductor companies, such as Robert Cao, who is the founder of UMC, second largest fab in Taiwan, or MK Tsai, the chairman and the founder of MediaTek, a fabless IC design company. And in addition to this, semiconductor is a very utility-heavy manufacturing industry. So you would need land, water, and consistent supply of electricity to be able to keep the production going. So during those days, we made it a very conscious choice to choose this industry as our so-called pioneer industry. And out of the very sophisticated segmentation of the ecosystem, we choose manufacturing of the entire semiconductor ecosystem to be the industry we focus on, because we realize only when you provide the best service and engineering to your customers can you grow and learn with your customers. So we made an effort that we don't make competition with the customers. We only make products for them. In other words, you have Intel and Samsung. They are manufacturers of the chips, but they also build their own chips. Whereas if you look at TSMC and UMC, they don't have their own chips, but they only work with the customers. And because this industry at the time has gone through such a technological breakthrough because of Moore's law, and the key of the Moore's law is really in its manufacturing. And so when you have a really strong design capability and you matched with a relentless focus on manufacturing excellence, then you create this unbreakable loop of constant churning up of innovation. So this type of a formula has become a very success formula. And so over the years, it continued to develop and develop, and we continue to invest more and more resources and build out the ecosystem. And that's how you see today's semiconductor industry successful in Taiwan.
So you've given the recipe, or at least what worked for Taiwan at a certain stage and age. Konark, would you like to say anything about India and its experiments with science parks and providing these other kinds of services? Or would you like to, go ahead.
So India had a policy on semiconductors, which came out in 2021 December. And really, it was one of the first countries to come up with the policy. It was offering around a $10 billion subsidy to basically all kinds of chip makers to come and manufacture in India. The initial uptake was a bit slow, but in the last couple of months, especially the last 1 year, I would say since June onwards, you've seen the likes of Micron come on board and sort of announce and actually broken ground on an assembly and packaging facility in Gujarat in India. And more recently, in the last 1 month, you sort of had PSMC. Now, PSMC has not made an equity investment. It's more of a tech transfer thing to the Indian industrial group Tatas. But it's a good start in the last 2 years. The point which India should really think about, I think, is how do you get there to be a sunk cost? So the issue is, once you stop these subsidies, it's very much possible that the chip makers might just not, continue investing in India. And when you're sort of competing with the likes of Japan, Korea, EU, and US when it comes to chip subsidies, that's a real concern. So I think the issue for India would be, how do we upgrade ourselves from packaging to sort of manufacturing to the point that there's more value add happening in India? So, I mean, I know I spoke about mobile phones, but that's an example I can give. Where currently it's only assembly. If you sort of have more contract manufacturing happening in India by Indian entities, then it's harder for a manufacturer to just close shop the moment the subsidies also stop, right? So I think India would have to work out what Professor Wong said at the beginning of this, discussion, how we need to have an ecosystem. It shouldn't be just at any one particular stage. I think we need to sort of make sure that all the players have sort of sunk costs here and the value addition is not minimal. It's basically as high as possible, thereby getting them to invest more in India and, essentially making it harder for them to leave, if somebody else overseas was to offer more subsidies. So I think as far as the financial package goes, that's the concern. On the technological front, of course, Professor Wong is the expert here. But I think one thing where India can probably think about entering is into prototyping. So as the complexity of the chip design process increases, what's required is that you need people at the supply chain to coordinate with each other more frequently. Essentially what this means for India is also that in practical terms, you need to have chips manufactured in basically smaller quantities. So basically, you need to have a proof of concept to make sure that before you order large runs of these chips, you sort of have a proof of concept that these chips work. Now, India can probably serve as a place where these, prototyping of chips can happen. India has some foundries set up in the state of Punjab and Mohali. which already serves the Indian defense establishment. Probably that could be a test use case for sort of doing something in prototyping. So on the technological shift, it's not a massive shift, as was seen in the case of Taiwan. Like, for example, when we speak about the fabless and the foundry distinction, which was made in the late 80s by Morris Chang, this is probably not as path-breaking, but I think as a technological opening goes, this is probably something India can exploit when it comes to prototyping solutions. And when it comes to subsidies, I think India will just have to, keep at it, to be honest. I mean, the kind of subsidies being offered by EU and US are far more in number. And I think for India to compete with that, you would have to really sort of get someone to, like a PSMC or like a Micron to really demonstrate that there's a case to be made in India for investing here.
Thank you. I think something that you're bringing up, maybe it would be just a little bit helpful to back up and take a bigger picture of the Indian ecosystem right now. India, in terms of semiconductor industry, it's clearly not where it wants to be. That's why it's putting this kind of investment into it. But on fabless, in areas like design, for instance, in areas like maybe not prototyping, but assembly, as Konark's mentioning, India has shown quite a lot of promise so far. So for instance, in design, I think there are more than 100 firms now in Bangalore alone, right next to a research park, set up in the 70s for software primarily. That's had quite a bit of success there. Konark, what it sounds like you're suggesting is building off of existing success and focusing in these smaller areas rather than swinging for the fences, going for a big play like a fab play which clearly would cost a lot of money and might come with a lot of risk too. Would that be a fair way of characterizing what you're describing?
I'd say definitely focus on all stages of the supply chain, not to the exclusion of only focusing on the foundry part. I think a foundry is important. We've seen that what happened in the pandemic. We saw a big shortage, of chips in the automotive sector. So I can't say that a foundry is not important, because even for defense and strategic purposes, it remains very important to have. But yes, I think a focus on where India currently has the strongest thing going forward is in the fabless sector, which is in the chip design sector. But if I may just add to that, Dinshaw, I would say that, often this figure gets brought up, how 20% of all the chip design engineers are based in India, especially in Bangalore. That's a good statistic, but I think it needs to be also, kept in mind that for the longest time, India served as the global capability center, or GCC, or sort of like an R&D hub for these firms, AMD, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, to sort of, develop chips in India. But for whatever reason, these chips were not deployed in India. So essentially, they were used in chips deployed overseas. So even though the chip was designed in India and Bangalore, but it was not really deployed in India. So I think the reason is because we didn't have a downstream market. There wasn't any case to be made for a robust electronic or a semiconductor market, which could actually embed these chips. So I think if we don't sort of address that part of the vertical, which is the foundry also, we'll probably keep on just remaining a player only in the fabless division as well. So I think the idea is to, yes, capitalize on your strengths, but also probably focus on the other sectors like foundry as well.
And just to push a little bit, are you saying that should focus on the supply chain as a whole right now, or you should do it sequentially or something like that?
I think it's important to sort of develop the downstream market. And I think what India has done here is trying to get the likes of the Apples, the Xiaomis, the Samsung, the Teslas even to come here and set up shop. Despite having a robust number of engineers in India in chip design, we don't really have any domestic chip design firms. I think the issue remains that we have served as a hub to develop talent which can be employed by overseas MNCs. But our own capability, indigenous capability, is not really there. So I would say, to keep the answer short, yes, focus on all stages, all verticals of the entire supply chain. But, foundry is important. Yeah.
Yep, that's very helpful. India is also, just in terms of its own market, one of the fastest growing users for chips with the economic growth that's taking place. It's a lot more demand for chips, and it's likely, or it's projected to be by 2030, 10% of the demand for chips worldwide. I think it might be useful just to flip this question a little bit as well. We've been talking a lot about what India can do, what India should do, what the value proposition is for India. Might be helpful just to put on the table for a moment what Taiwan gains or what companies in Taiwan gain from going beyond their own borders. And that would help us perhaps understand how India and Taiwan could work closer together. What would India's value proposition to a TSMC or to Taiwan be for closer collaboration? Why doesn't Taiwan just make chips at home and only focus on controlling the entire supply chain from there? What makes them look abroad? Maybe we'll start with Jason this time, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. We foresee a huge demand boom in the coming years for chips, whether it is for the high-end chips or the legacy chips. And this is due to the convergence of the technologies and also the fast advancement of the AI technologies. And this growth will propel this industry to be even more in high demand, and as well as on an exponential growth. And obviously, some people would argue there's a limit to Moore's law, because TSMC have already down to 2 nanometers or sub 2 nanometers. But there are other type of innovation that TSMC is now working on that could basically bypass the limit of the Moore's law. So I would say that as far as I can see, there's still a huge demand and also space for the technology and innovation breakthrough in the semiconductor industry. And as to why Taiwan needs to diversify its chips production, obviously there are two very probable reasons. One is the geopolitical pressure. As everyone knows, US and China are in the competition mode, and chips are obviously the crown jewel of the US-China tech competition. And in order for Taiwan to remain competitive and also supplying the important chips to the world, and most importantly to the US, and keeping Taiwan as the most important allies to continue to make chips for the US, we must do two things. One is to keep the most advanced nodes in Taiwan, so that the silicon shield can continue to protect Taiwan. And secondly, TSMC has to diversify to the extent that the geopolitical pressure is not overly dictate how their business are run. Currently, we have seen TSMC expanded to US, Japan, and Germany. The Arizona project is ongoing, which is set to be finished in 2025, although it's been delayed. And the Japan Kumamoto fab has just opened a few weeks ago, and now the second fab is being built. So is the project in Germany is also underway. So diversification is necessary, but we also have to be extra careful that if TSMC is spreading itself too thin and not be able to maintain the efficiency and the focus and the management effectiveness, this could also backfire the industry. And another uncertainty we foresee as the diversification or so-called decoupling, de-risking become ever more inevitable is, would China be able to control or dominate the legacy chips production? These are the chips used in our everyday life, in your microwave oven. Some of the chips used in your cars are legacy chips, and these are generally chips from 28 to 44 nanometers. And China has been doubling down on its investment, also in its industry development in this segment. US, however, is not focusing on this segment, and Japan is focusing on electric vehicles. And I argue that going forward, it is not only the advanced chips, your 5 nanometers, 3 nanometers, or sub 3 nanometers are important, but the legacy chips are even more important. And if without these chips, you simply can't run the economy. So we must think hard about whether we are focusing too much on these advanced nodes and not enough understanding or efforts on building these legacy chips. And in this segment, there are players that are operating on a very thin market because the technology is quite matured. But there are a lot of players, like you have your UMC, you have other companies that are so-called legacy chip manufacturers. So we have to figure out a way to also develop this ecosystem. For India's case, I would say to get into the advanced foundry manufacturing, it would be a very high bar. But to work with legacy chips makers such as UMC and other companies to start the ecosystem would be a low-hanging fruit. And from there, you could at least start building the know-how or have the certain inventories of the chips, because we don't know when the next the black swan event will happen, and at a time that it won't be the 3 nanometer chips that will keep your hospital running or roads operating or airports operating. It would be your legacy chips. So countries really need to think more about this segment.
It's very helpful. Professor Wang, would you like to add anything?
Yeah. One aspect is important is to think about. Let's just focus on one aspect, which is what Jason has already mentioned. Why TSMC built fabs in Japan, in Europe, in Germany, and also in the US. It is mainly because the customers are there. Whoever designs the chips and uses the chips, the customers are there. And so for another country to be able to attract companies like that to go there, you really need to ask, are there customers there? Because if there are no customers locally, there's no particular reason they to move it over there. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is to think about future growth of companies like that. In Taiwan, well, first of all, let me just say that the semiconductor manufacturing is a high-skilled manufacturing, and it is not like you can run a factory with a bunch of low-skilled laborers. If you look at the employee profile of TSMC, 75% of the employees have a bachelor's degree and above, and 50% of the employees have a master's degree and above. So the level of education of the employees for a fab like that is pretty high. And so then you need to ask, where do the talents come from? And for TSMC, for example, for them to grow, I would expect that they need to have more talent. And as many of you know, the birth rate in Taiwan is pretty low, one of the lowest in the world. And the tech industry in Taiwan has already scooped up almost everybody that's available in the island of Taiwan. So for companies to grow even further, then because this is a high-skilled labor industry, for the companies to grow further, they need to ask where do they get the talents from? And so expanding in places like Japan and US and Europe, where there are talents there, is also a reasonable expectation. Of course, in India, India has abundance of talents. Many of the talents in the US came from India. You have wonderful universities, the IITs and so on. They're wonderful universities. They turn out wonderful students. I have many of those students myself at Stanford in the past and also currently. So at least on this count, India has a wonderful resource, which is the talent pool that you have.
That's great. Well, I want to talk more about that talent in a second. One of the big contrasts, I think, with that talent is that you mentioned the Taiwanese would come and learn in the US and then they would go back. Indian talent tends to be a little bit more stuck to staying in the US and hasn't gone back as much. But before we do that, it sounds like, just to summarize what I'm hearing, there are geopolitical factors here for diversification. They're looking at places where customers are located. And India has that emerging market, but it's not perhaps, I mean, it's certainly nothing like Germany or Japan at this stage, or the US. But customers being there. And then I liked this idea about focusing on legacy chip production rather than the more fancy, perhaps more glamorous, cutting edge, bleeding edge sort of segment of chip manufacturing. Is that so? We see India repeatedly approaching these fancy foreign companies to try and develop advanced manufacturing. Konak, would you say that government right now is recognizing the potential of focusing on, for lack of a better term, less sexy areas of the supply chain, or not just the supply chain, but the semiconductor industry as a whole? Or do they like the more flashy sorts of things that might distract them from actually creating a functioning industry?
Sure. So those are some excellent points made about the mature nodes. The Indian government, initially when the policy came out, they were offering a 50% subsidy for advanced nodes, a 40% subsidy for nodes between 28 to 45 nanometer, and I think a 30% subsidy for even more mature nodes. Then in 2022 October, the government realized that it was never going to sort of get the likes of TSMC or Intel to at least commit in the first 1 year of the policy to making advanced node manufacturing in India. So what they did was that they essentially rationalized the entire subsidy, framework. They essentially said, okay, we're not going to be offering only 50% to the most advanced nodes, but we'll be offering 50% to everyone at the mature node level as well. So clearly that hints that the government has got the message that we'll not just be focusing on the below 15 nanometer or below 25 nanometer nodes, but also focusing on the more advanced, the more mature nodes as well. In this regard, there's actually a strong downstream market in India. When it comes to defense equipment, most of it does use like mature nodes. If you're talking about other items like CCTVs, point of sale terminals, drones, all things in which India is sort of seeking to now enhance its manufacturing footprint, these are all devices which use mature nodes. So I think the Indian government has got that message. Even the recent announcement of a joint fab between the Tatas and PSMC is also in the mature node segment. It's 28 nanometer and above. So I think these two decisions highlight that the government is cognizant of the fact that advanced node manufacturing is going to be some years away. So yeah, I think the message has certainly been taken by the Indian government that they need to focus on the more mature nodes. And I think the subsidy structure also does demonstrate that.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So it's not just trying to recruit in some other areas, like for instance, they're going after Apple in a big way rather than trying to create Apple in India. They're trying to get some of these fancier brand name companies in, Tesla as well. But it sounds like they're more sophisticated in thinking about how they might target the the right aspect of the industry. All right, let's get to high-skilled manufacturing and what kind of a talent pool India has for this. Professor Wong mentioned the IITs. They've had quite a lot of success. India has had quite a lot of success in churning out tech talent, not just in the hardware sector and even in semiconductors. You find a lot of talented executives as well as manufacturers, but also in software industry as well. India has a growing pool of engineers of varying quality, admittedly, but that certainly seems to be something that could be an area for India's favor. Certainly when you compare Japan, the US, in these kinds of countries, if you're thinking about just in terms of manpower and number of engineers created, India is among the leaders in the world in terms of just numbers. It might not be in terms of the overall top quality. I would argue that you can still find those good eggs, but just in terms of overall manpower, India produces quite a bit. What's the level of cooperation between India and Taiwan in terms of student talent? Because they're producing lots of great students. Undergraduates are coming out from the IITs. Some of them will go and study abroad. More often than not, they come out here to the US for their studies. Is there anything happening right now that anybody knows about in terms of how Indians are learning in Taiwan? This could also not just be students, but it sounds like executives as well, or other kinds of mid-level, upper-level business cooperation. Maybe I'll ask Jason, do you know what the status is right now on this?
Yeah, when I was in the legislature, I remember seeing the statistics is that there are, I think, 4,000 Indian students every year coming to study in Taiwan. And many of those either get internships, or those who study the advanced degrees in engineering get internships at related field in science park or end up staying. And as a matter of fact, if you walk around the science park, you will see quite a few Indian engineers. And in some parts of the science park, and they even have a dedicated cafeteria for Indian food for the Indian engineers. And I remember meeting with the Indian representative to Taiwan, and he had proposed an idea of setting up the so-called Taiwan-India talent corridor, basically to continuously offer what I call a high-tech visa for Indians to work, and then eventually, set up families in Taiwan. And U.S. continues to be the #1 choice for Indians to go there. But we wanted to also develop Taiwan to be an attractive destination too. So I feel we have a lot to share and also to benefit from each other in this perspective. Taiwan needs more talent, more engineers, and India produce very capable students and very skillful engineers. So we should make this Taiwan-India talent corridor a strong propositions to both governments, because I would say this is more important than trade or goods and products, because when you have talent exchange, you then also share knowledge and as well as the technology know-how. So I hope the number has gone up since I was in the government, and it should be developed and also be putting more resources to make it even more stronger program.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I'm actually doing a project right now on looking at the Indian diaspora and their successes in the US. And one of the things that's really been striking to me is we've got some surveys as well, but I've been interviewing prominent Indians who decided to settle in the US. One of the things that's been very noticeable is that for many of these people who came in the 60s, 70s, 80s, their memories were shaped by prominent events in the US. So the landing on the moon, listening to American rock music, stuff like that, even in their dorms. They might have been in Delhi or in some rural area in the middle of nowhere in India, but all of their friends around them were talking about the US, thinking about the US, participating culturally in US kinds of activities. Might also be helpful just as we think about ways to recruit Indians to Taiwan, to also just promote Taiwanese culture broadly, because there's a very rich culture there. But this is a great idea, this developing this Taiwan-India talent corridor. And whether or not the Indians return, if they stay in Taiwan, that redounds to both countries' benefits, that expertise, that knowledge sharing, the remittances, enriching people, giving more opportunities, or if they return to India, that seems quite exciting as well. Professor Wong, you mentioned this talent from India, and you've mentioned that you've got some students there from India as well in your own labs. Do you think that it makes sense to also try and recruit Indians back to, Indians who are studying in America back to India? Or should we keep the focus on perhaps expanding this India-Taiwan partnership that Jason mentioned, or should we be doing all of the above?
Well, certainly we should do all the above, all right? And maybe I'd make two comments in these two aspects. One, first, the talent pool in the US for people who are originally from India is enormous, I would say. It's really enormous. You know, there's a saying in Silicon Valley that the integrated circuits or IC industry is really an IC industry, Indians and Chinese. So, so the talent pool of semiconductors that are of Indian origin in the US is enormous. So then it really behooves the Indian government to think about what can they do to attract those humongous talent pool, very experienced talent and very capable talent back to India. At least some of them back to India. What can they do to entice them to come back? I think that would create a huge difference, I think, because industries, companies are started and nurtured and grown by people. And it's not just money. There's capital, of course, but people. People is important. You think about new companies in Silicon Valley, and it's really due to the people who are in the company, either the engineering resources or the management resources that grows a company. So I think it is really important for governments to think about how could attract those talent, and India already have a inborn advantage in having this talent pool that it could tap into. Second point I want to make is about this India-Taiwan collaboration. I don't have official numbers in my head, but I only have anecdotal evidence. I spent some years working in Taiwan at TSMC, as some of you may know, that I also interacted with many universities in Taiwan to understand how they train the students and where the talents come from. I think there are two difficulties there. One is the language barrier. The Taiwanese society is still by and large, the general society is still by and large Chinese language based. And even in companies like very international companies like TSMC, even though like many businesses, much of the business are conducted in English, it is way easier if a employee can also speak Chinese. And so oftentimes the Indian engineers who live and work in Taiwan face a rather significant cultural barrier. in terms of language. On the university side, I remember several years ago, one of the universities make a big investment into recruiting Indian students into Taiwan with the hope that they will stay. Many of them will stay in Taiwan and work there, so to increase the overall talent pool. But I guess after a few years, they found that it wasn't that successful largely because of the cultural and language barrier, that the Indian students feel a little bit isolated because they don't speak the local language. It's harder to learn. It's pretty hard to learn the Chinese language. And I remember the university even created a cafeteria of Indian food because they know that they want to attract the Indian students. But after a while, that Indian restaurant closed down because there's not enough students. So there's a big barrier there. And in fact, I think this cultural barrier is not so much for India to solve. I think it's more for Taiwan to solve, because I believe the Taiwan society needs to be more international, needs to be able to speak English better. And in fact, one of the suggestions I made to the Taiwanese government was to increase the level of English education in Taiwan, so that more people in Taiwan can conduct themselves, their lives, or be fluent and proficient in English. And that would really help in training and attracting talent. India is all Indian students speaks English really well. So that's not a problem that from the Indian side, I believe. It is more a problem from the Taiwan side to solve.
That's really helpful. Thank you. It sounds like India is going to have hopefully some competition, and this will be good competition in terms of trying to attract its students back once they go to Taiwan and once they come to the US. Karnak, maybe you can speak a little bit about, we've talked about PLI and Make in India scheme. What's the government doing by way of trying to attract talented people back to the country right now? Is it doing the same kinds of things that we're hearing Taiwan did to try and pull their people back? Or is it not really an attention area at this point?
Sure. So the government does not have a dedicated scheme right now, from what I understand, to get expatriates back to India. What it has done is it realizes that if it wants to become a major semiconductor hub, it would have to, as spoken at the beginning of this discussion by Professor Wong, excuse me, how we will need a lot of talent as well. So I think the Indian government has come out with this thing called C2S, Chips to Startup Scheme, which is basically aimed at training 85,000 engineers. Now they have partnered, from what I understand, with 3 institutions. One is IMEC in Belgium, one is A-Star in Singapore, and the other one is indeed ITRI there in Taiwan. So they've actually sort of officially forged a memorandum of understanding with these 3 institutions, where they will essentially seek to train Indian engineers better in the semiconductor ecosystem. Now, as far as the talent corridor is concerned with Taiwan, I do understand that the Indian government announced a plan to set up a body similar to the IMEC and ISR and the ITRI in Taiwan. It's called ISRC, or Indian Semiconductor Research Center. I understand that they have come up with a board of advisors here, which comprises of individuals and executives from top semiconductor companies, including some from Taiwan, like say MediaTek. So they've actually listened. They've actually tried to get these people to decide what should an ideal training institution look like in the Indian context. Also, I just want to add this bit about the talent corridor. I do understand that there's a lot of focus on how Indian engineers overseas can be brought back, but I think what's easier probably in the short term for India is to look at how we can get academia from overseas, be it Taiwan, be it the US, to come to India, for teaching engagements. And that's not really been an attractive scheme for too many academia members. But the Indian government has launched this scheme a few years back called the GIAN, the Global Initiative for Academic Networks, which is called GYAN, which translates in Hindi to knowledge. So they've actually tried to get professors to come for 2-month engagements to India. And in doing so, they've tried to pay them salary, which is at par with the salary they would be paid in the US for about 2 months. So they understand that coming to India is not an easy proposition for a lot of members of the academia because they take a pay cut. They have some ongoing research happening in the labs in the US. So the current focus of the GIAN policy is to really look at how do we get people to come, they get remunerated fairly, what they would get paid in the US, and they have access to a huge cohort of students in India who are trying to learn semiconductor engineering. So I think the focus can also be not just on recruiting Indian expatriates overseas, but on training the current crop of engineers in India. And how do we get the academia from Taiwan and US to come to India and come for short teaching engagements? So while no coherent policy on recruiting expatriates, but certainly there's something in the works when it comes to training the current crop of engineers.
Yeah, maybe I can chime in on that a little bit on the getting the faculty to engage with India as well. So we set up something called National Semiconductor Institute, which is organized by 4 prominent universities in Taiwan to train semiconductor professionals and talent. So they develop programs specifically to train semiconductor and advanced degrees programs. So I know the program directors of these 4 universities. I'd be happy to connect with our Indian friends or counterparts who might be interested in having collaborations with them. And I just hosted a delegation from the US to visit these universities and institutes. And so there are already alliances being built between Taiwan and US, and I believe the same can also be built with India as well.
That's great. That's really helpful. Hopefully somebody on this call will follow up, take Jason up on his offer. I'll mention just again, anecdotally, I always love it when we talk about more academic collaboration between US and India. My dad is actually on sabbatical this semester from his engineering university in the US, and he's spending it at one of the IITs, which is a nice development. Previously, it was a lot harder to do things. Government still hasn't quite figured that recipe out, but it's nice to see it happening. I would say in India, there's a bit of a challenge because the university industry nexus, really the only pipeline I would argue there is by way of students. So they train students that might end up going into the industry. You still don't have a very robust, developed research side on the universities that can then spill over into potential businesses and startups and things like that. I'm just wondering, in Taiwan, what's the relationship between universities and large companies like semiconductor firms? Do you find, I mean, Professor Wong is a good example of this since he straddles both lines, but do you find Taiwanese universities also professors being both in the corporate world as well as in the academic world? Or is there some kind of a dividing line there?
In Taiwan, maybe I'll start here. In Taiwan, the universities are very aware of and very collaborative and working with the industry. And for example, the TSMC work with many universities in Taiwan, supports the research and hire the students as interns and so on. And in turn, the university professors do projects based on the research directions that they learn from the industry, not only in the foundry business, but also in design and other related fields. So I think there's a very nice symbiotic relationship between the universities, the professors, and the research directions and the teaching programs that they make a very strong effort in making sure that those research and education that they do are relevant to the industry. And in return, the industry are supportive of the universities because they know this is where their future engineers come from, and so their capture rate is pretty high. So I think that what they have done pretty well in that sense, the symbiotic relationship between universities and the industry in Taiwan. Jason, you may want to add on to this because they're more familiar with the Taiwan local situation than I am.
Yeah, obviously we have a very tight relationships between industry and universities, especially within the peripherals of Science Park. There are two very prominent universities. One is National Tsinghua University, and the other is National Yangming Jiaotong Universities. These are two primary universities that have a very tight relationship with semiconductor industries, and many semiconductor executives teach part-time at these universities as well. And so the Semiconductor Institute that I mentioned are also located within these two universities. So as you can see that it becomes a very readily available pipeline, and students can get on-the-job training, or where they are in school, they can really put what they learn to practice in that regard, and sort of develop real problem-solving skills. And sometimes companies commission professors to do research or to work on problems that can be used in the actual solving problem-solving situations in the semiconductor industry. And so this is becoming a very close, very highly interactive loop with the university and industry.
That's really great. That sounds like a potential model for India to explore as well, how it might develop these kinds of industry academic partnerships. I want to ask a few more questions, but before I do, I'd just like to mention that if there's anybody watching out there, please feel free to write in Q&A. Just write in your questions into the chat, and we will make sure to get to them. While we wait for some of those questions to come in, Konark, can you tell us a little bit about, we've been talking now about the various ways that Taiwan has gone about its progress across these different dimensions. I'd just like to hear whether you think you're optimistic on the whole, just stepping back from all of these specifics. If you're optimistic on the whole that India can crack the semiconductor nut, or whether there's some things that we haven't talked about that are missing. For instance, Taiwan also has a lot more traction with lower level manufacturing. Most countries, the typical process for manufacturing has been to focus on low and then go to more advanced levels of manufacturing. India hasn't done that. But then if we look at what's going on right now with a lot of countries trying to re-enter the semiconductor space, it's not like, for instance, Germany or the US have a lot of low-end manufacturing either. Is there some sort of a time period where perhaps India doesn't really need to bother with low-end manufacturing, you can just jump straight into this advanced manufacturing? Or is this something that would help semiconductors? And if you think there's anything else more generally that we haven't put on the table, I would invite you to chime in here.
So I'm optimistic given what's happened in the last 1.5 years, Dinshaw. So it was really not expected by anyone that a country like India, which has so far been, punching way below its weight when it comes to semiconductors, would ever get investments from the likes of Micron and, sort of get someone like a PSMC, who's not maybe like a UMC or like a TSMC, but still a major player in its own right, to come to India and partner with Tatas in a span of 1.5 years. So I think I count those as very big wins to begin with. So I would say it's pretty optimistic. Regarding the policy measures which have been taken, I think the Indian government is hitting on the right notes when it comes to things like land acquisition for these, foundries, when it comes to, for example, I mentioned the chips to startup scheme to train 85,000 engineers in India. There's also this thing about, funding. So from what I hear that there's currently $10 billion in offer, but now, given the success of the scheme, they'll probably to try to top this up after the elections in India with another $10 billion possibly as well. So there's certainly optimism in the government when it comes to putting more money into the kitty on the semiconductor policy front. One thing I'd probably say, which is given less importance, is the issue of trade. Some companies might not necessarily offshoring from China. There are so many options. There's Vietnam, there's Malaysia. Just the other day, there was a piece in the Financial Times about how Malaysia has been the biggest winner of the chip wars between US and China. I think the issue of trade is important because this is something which gets brought up to me on many of the discussions I've had, which is if a company is relocating its assembly and packaging operations, let alone the foundry operations, from, say, China, why would it come to India, which has a different tariff structure than, say, China? Right, China has signed this thing called the RCEP, which is the biggest trade bloc in the entire world, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So if a company was to sort of move away from China and consider options between Malaysia, Vietnam, and India, if the tariff structure in Vietnam and Malaysia is similar to that in China, why would it want to renegotiate a completely different set of custom duties in India? So I think going forward, India would probably have to look at that part of the issue. And they've been making all the right noises. They've been talking about how they will be taking some big decisions, some big progressive decisions, as they put it, after the Indian elections. Now, does that mean striking more FTAs with countries who we need to partner with? That's not really known right now. But I would say that the trade issue is certainly which gets less attention than it should. So overall, I would say yes, I'm optimistic about how things might proceed, but the trade issue certainly needs more clarity.
That's really helpful. Excuse me.
Yeah, one thing I would like to comment on the $10 billion semiconductor fund is this is an industry that's really capital intensive. So US's CHIPS Act is $52 billion, but TSMC alone, its capex is 180 billion in the next 3 years. So you don't want this money to be wasted just to give it away. So you need to be very strategic about how you spend the money, because this is just not a arms race in terms of who spends more money. Because no matter how much you spend, you are never gonna outspend the industry as a government, unless you are China. The Chinese is basically, China government, they basically had endless money that they can use. But I think in India's instance, I think you have to be very strategic about choosing your battle and basically developing a very strategic positioning on what segment to go into in terms of developing your semiconductor advantage. Now we're talking about semiconductor industry, but you really need to think about where is your semiconductor advantage. If it's just to compete with other countries on the foundry, Japan already supported TSMC 4.56 billion. It will continue to support more, maybe double that amount in the next 6 months to 12 months. If countries go into this spending spree on just creating semiconductor fabs, I think we will end up with a lot of empty promises. So just be very careful and strategic about how you use the money. That's how I would give the advice I would give to the Indian government.
That's really helpful. So one of the things, and this would be really helpful to understand in Taiwan's case, how this worked out. But one of the things that happens in some countries is that decisions in industrial policy are made by government officials who might not have perhaps a technical background, might not come from industry itself. They've risen up through their own paths. In other countries, we've seen when you open it up and you say there's subsidies to be made, one company comes in or a few companies come in and really capture the entire process of government decision making to the point where they're just taking subsidies without really delivering what might be expected. seems like those are two extremes, and Taiwan was able to walk the fine balance where there was a nexus between government officials who were empowered to make decisions and taking industry inputs into account in a productive way. I think that historically this has been a really big problem for India. You look at the committees that were formed for semiconductors in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Oftentimes it was only government officials with very little private sector input. They really erred on that one extreme, really concerned that private sector would come in and take over. Do you have any suggestions on how Taiwan basically walks that fine balance and how India might think about consulting with its industry without being overtaken by them? Maybe, Jason, you might want to start us off on this.
Can you clarify your question? You mean that how industry can, yeah, please clarify. I didn't quite get it.
So this is top-end industrial policy, and industrial policy. If you've just got government making the moves, there's a nice quote by a political economist named Charles Lindblom that government is basically thumbs, whereas actors in the market are fingers. And you really want both of those to work in concert to really be able to do the right kinds of things. If you're just thumbs, you can regulate and push hard and push money out, but that doesn't necessarily make things work. And if you're just industry, yeah, you can do some pretty nimble things and you can do this sort of stuff, but you don't really get the full weight of it. So how does Taiwan sort of run that balance where it's not just government saying this is what we're going to do, but they productively take into account what industry wants without just becoming captured by industry? Does that make
absolutely.
sense?
Yeah. So initially, obviously, government had a very important role to play, but that was really just the initial startup stage, which was in the 1980s. But now that this industry has become matured and also very developed, and the players have a clear strategy and the positioning, and government sort of take a step back just to provide the right type of environment, and obviously in the case of Taiwan is to provide reliable electricity and water, and then to make sure that our policies are conducive to the semiconductor industry's development with respect to talent, tax benefit, and again, want to stress the electricity and water. And money is not really the most important part. And it seems to me other countries use monetary kind of incentives to pin down this industry. But if you look at Taiwan, almost semiconductor companies, successful ones, are not reliant on government. They are mostly work very tightly with customers, and then they grow as customers grow, and then they grow as the market grows. So I think government's role is to create a favorable and fair competitive environment for this ecosystem can thrive, and then you want to pick a few winners that can really charge or power this industry. And in this case, since semiconductor is such a capital intensive and very technologically sophisticated industry, you have like one top player. You maybe have two or three, but the number two and number three are typically much behind than the winner. So you want to be able to create that competition environment that at the end of the day, the battle that you choose, you will emerge as a winner, and other markets would look to you to provide reliable sources of the products. And certainly that's how Taiwan has becoming the winner in this part. And you want to stay as a winner, so you want to continuously invest in this industry, especially in R&D, correct if I'm wrong, Philip, but I know that TSMC invests up to more than 20% of its revenue to the R&D. So government, I think, play two roles. One is to create a conducive and a fair competition environment for the ecosystem. And secondly, to act as a smart buyer. You wanted your money to be used smartly instead of, going into arms race for spending money, but you want to be strategic on how you would procure the services or to enable the industry. So I think that's the role of the government that should play.
That's very helpful. Philip, do you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, on this part, I think there has to be a balance struck between policymakers and the experts that they rely on to understand the implications of the policies. In the beginning, I mentioned three ingredients of the success: government support and the ecosystem and talent, and also a change in the business environment for the industry. Now, who can spot these changes in technology and the marketplace are really the experts in the field, not government officials. And that's very important. So as we think about government policies and think about what to invest in and how and so on, I think it would be really important to seek the advice of experts, whether they come from industry or come from academia. And in fact, India has a wonderful resource, which is all the Indian experts in this field who are of Indian origin scattered around the world that you can count on. You don't need to count on people who are local to India who you may be concerned about conflict of interest and lining their own pockets and so on. But you have a wonderful talent pool that you can draw from to get advice from.
That's really helpful. Perhaps putting together an expert advisory of people drawn from industry from elsewhere of Indian origin could be something that's developed. I don't think, I might be wrong, Konark, you might know this better than I do, but I don't think the main semiconductor working groups and things like that have very many foreign experts. They have some, but just not as many as they might consider personally.
Can I chime in here a little bit?
Yeah, please.
So I think you, Disha, right? You had a good point on the Indian diaspora. I think India diaspora, particularly around the world in the tech area, world, Silicon Valley, have some of the very influential leaders. You have the CEO of Google and Microsoft, both are Indian diaspora. And I think at this age of semiconductor and AI, it's really important to enlist the support from these influential Indian tech leaders as the country is thinking about building its semiconductor industry. At the end of the day, the chips will be used to develop the country's compute capability. And so if you could start by identifying some of these big players to allocate the resources to India, and then probably to develop AI research center or to develop a semiconductor research center in India, I think would be a good first step. And for example, in the case of Taiwan, we have Jensen Huang, who is a Taiwanese descent, who is the founder and CEO of NVIDIA. Lisa Su, who is also CEO of AMD, both has roots in Taiwan, and we've also worked very hard to also develop strategy and initiatives so that they could do more with Taiwan. And when we are also manufacturing chips, but we also want the applications to be relevant and close to our manufacturing as well.
That's really helpful. I've seen a lot of Indian diaspora pull back resources, or not pull back, but cooperate with India much more in the software industry in particular. Even when Texas Instruments was first making its forays into India, it was these Indian vice presidents that were doing a lot of this. And they did try to do some chip work with India back then, but it was really software and telecom that really took off in a much bigger way. But this is a really helpful suggestion. I think if we can get those people, as you've mentioned, there are a lot of Indians now in the semiconductor space and the hardware space. We can get them to start thinking about how they might work with India more. That could be a really bountiful cooperative area. So we've got a question from Simran Dali. Curious to know if the elections in Taiwan with President Lai have changed Taiwan's stance on India-Taiwan relations, and if there's a potential for a free trade pact or any other kinds of collaboration there. As our resident politician, Jason, maybe you wanna take this one first, and if this election means anything for India-Taiwan relations.
Sure. So since 8 years ago, President Tsai, who is going to step down in May, have promoted so-called New Southbound policy, which is an initiative to attract more collaborations with the Southeast Asia countries and as well as India. And the Taiwan-India Talent Corridor initiative is one that also started during this period. With the new president taking office in May, I don't see any change in this regard. I would advocate and also welcome deeper and more collaborations between Taiwan and India. Obviously, from the perspective of the talent, training, to trade, and those are all very important areas. And because of the US and China competition, more and more Taiwanese firms are leaving China, and India is an ideal location for Taiwanese firms to relocate. We've also seen Apple has required 25% or 1 out of every 4 iPhones to be now manufactured in India. And Taiwan's iPhone supply chain ecosystem has also made strides into relocating to India as well. So we welcome any collaborations from the industry to academic to people exchange, and certainly, you know, a free trade agreement between Taiwan and India would be most welcome, and it would have a significant meaning for the two countries to mark as a very strong relationships and partnerships in various aspects.
Very well said. That's very diplomatic. Thank you. We've also got elections taking place in another small little democracy in the next few weeks. India is going to the polls. I think it starts April 19th. So about a month from now. Last week, Prime Minister Modi was on the campaign trail, but he was also setting foundation stones for many new foundries that were being opened up. It seems like semiconductors, advanced manufacturing is now going to become a feature of politics, and certainly what he's promising to do if he's elected to a third term. Konark, maybe you can speak a little bit what we might expect, both in terms of the elections and then in terms of what might happen assuming that Modi comes in for a third term.
So
in terms of semiconductors, excuse me. Sorry, yeah.
Sure. In terms of semiconductors, I think the momentum has been good. They will certainly try to speak to other companies. So I understand that certain companies like Tower Semiconductors had made sort of a proposal for investment, but is currently caught up because of certain legal issues. But the idea is to sort of keep the momentum going. So like I said before, in the course of this online discussion, the government will be looking to top up that earlier $10 billion, subsidy package with another $10 billion. Now, again, it's not a lot of money compared to the ones being offered by the US and Japan. But the idea is not to really go all out and sort of establish advanced manufacturing or advanced node manufacturing facilities. The idea is to look at the more mature nodes and to look at how they can serve the Indian market for now. So I think you can expect the Indian government to continue with its policy on semiconductors. One thing they'll probably want to do is that they will probably think about, looking at the Indian Semiconductor Mission, which is the agency within the Ministry of Electronics and IT, which screens and vets all the investments, how we can sort of do capacity building in that body. Currently, it's a new body. It's only been around for 2 years. They're trying to beef up the kind of capacity it has. So I think they'll probably try to increase the manpower when it comes to the actual body which screens investments. But overall policy on semiconductors, I think, will remain strong because from what I understand, this is a very much a top-down approach. This is definitely something which the Prime Minister himself is monitoring from the PMO or from the Prime Minister's office. So I think certainly the momentum will continue in this. Uh, Other thing is that this policy is also more attractive compared to the other PLI schemes I mentioned, because the PLI scheme, it should be noted, is on a reimbursement basis, whereas the semiconductor scheme is on a directly upfront basis. So whatever financial support is offered is given directly upfront without any reimbursement. And I think thirdly, as the Indian downstream market develops even more, and the case for lead firms to move to India becomes even more compelling, we'll probably see a rationale for semiconductor manufacturing in India to become even more prominent. So I would say three reasons: a top-down approach, more upfront money as a part of the policy, and a more robust downstream market in the years to come are reasons why I think semiconductor ecosystem in India will see sustained growth.
That's great. Then just stepping back, I had originally framed the question to Jason, not about future of semiconductor, but about India-Taiwan cooperation. Do you think in Modi's third term, we might see some progress towards free trade agreement or stronger relations between India and Taiwan that goes beyond semiconductors? Anything we should be looking at or expecting in that space?
So it's difficult to say right now. I'm sorry. Just you want to come
No,
in?
go ahead. No, go.
Sure. So I was saying it's difficult to sort of assume, as Jason pointed out, there's a north-southbound policy. There's not much which has happened in the last couple of years, barring a recent development where they signed a memorandum of understanding to sort of allow Indian migrant workers to move to Taiwan. But that's on the low end of the spectrum. It's not really high-skilled labor. So as far as an FTA goes, my understanding is India will dip its toes into the FTA waters very carefully. Just last month, it signed something with 4 European nations: Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Sweden, and I think Norway as well. So it's not really going into an FTA with the major countries which have the capacity to sort of provide you with say major goods. It's not looking at that part of the puzzle right now. I think it's going to sort of ramp up its engagement on FTAs with other countries, which is currently engaged with. I know there's one with the EU, there's one with the UK, and there's what even talks about doing one with the US as well. So I think it'll probably try to tackle those ones first before it moves on to one with Taiwan. But that's just what I feel right now. Yeah.
That's very helpful. We've got a question from Daphne Singh. It's actually a couple of questions, and this is mostly, I would say, for perhaps Konark can answer. Oh, sorry. Philip, I think you wanted to say something. I didn't mean to jump off from you. Did you have something to add? Or Jason?
No, I don't.
Okay, all right. So this is from Daphne Singh. First question is, how did the Make in India policy and PLI scheme work to attract foreign manufacturing firms? Is it just from countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan? What's going on with the foreign manufacturing and how they're trying to attract these kinds of opportunities, Konark?
Sure. So I know that Samsung had taken up the PLI scheme in a big way, but there was a concern which came in the press, and I don't know what is the current status of this particular issue. But there was a thing that the reimbursement from the government usually takes some time to come through. So there was that concern for the firms which want to avail the PLI scheme, that sometimes the government sort of is not able to provide a timely resolution of the reimbursement issues, but that was a while back. I'm not aware of the current status when it comes to Samsung and other Korean companies. On to the other question about whether it's easier to attract Japanese and South Korean firms other than Taiwanese ones. I mean, really speaking, the focus has been on mobile phone manufacturing, right? So really, it's the likes of the Xiaomis, the Oppos, and the Samsungs and the Apples, which are really the key focus right now. The semiconductor scheme is sort of a different scheme altogether. It's not necessarily predicated on, incremental production. It's based on basically setting up a fab in India, and you get upfront money right up. I mean, there's no such thing as reimbursement there. So I don't know if one can equate the semiconductor scheme, which is a different kind of a scheme, which focuses on upfront money, as opposed to a PLI scheme, which is based on incremental quarterly targets and it's based on reimbursement. It's altogether, I think, a different ball game. Would there be any specific sectors that the Indian government is targeting other than semiconductors? So the Indian government just last week, and I have to go through this, but they came out with an electric vehicle policy. So I do understand that they were in talks with Tesla for the longest time to sort of, bring Tesla to India, and also not just Tesla, but its entire supply chain of people who work in the entire value chain. I don't think those talks worked out the way Tesla would have hoped, because what they've come out with now is a generic policy which is applicable to all manufacturers of EVs. It's not just focused to an ad hoc or a case-by-case approval of Tesla. So I think, yeah, EV sector already had a PLI policy, but now they have a dedicated scheme as well, where the government is offering around major incentives, but I think the minimum investment there also is around $500 million. So the government expects the firms who come in as a part of the EV policy to invest $500 million, which is not a small amount. So I would say that is the one area where you'll probably see a lot of focus going forward, given how EV batteries are also sort of a place where India wants to sort of, rest some kind of a position in the supply chain compared to China, which is completely dominating it right now. So I would say the EV sector for that.
That's really helpful. And just to perhaps follow up with this question, a lot of foreign businesses, especially from the US, but also from elsewhere, oftentimes complain that they're sometimes at a disadvantage when they come into India, especially if they come in without a partnership, an Indian partnership. Semiconductor space sounds a little bit different. Obviously, the big efforts have been usually with collaborations with an Indian conglomerate working as well. But it seems like in iPhones, like for instance, Foxconn could almost set up their own sort of assembly plants and things like that. How do you see this changing in the coming years? Or do you think that it's going to be, if you're an outsider coming in, that you still want to partner with one of the main Indian conglomerates?
So I don't think there's any kind of push from the government to partner with Indian companies. I know in China, sometimes the move was that you sort of compel foreign companies to partner into a JV with local firms. That's not the approach I've seen in India, at least. Like, for example, even the Micron investment was something on which Micron invested alone. There was no Indian partner there. So I don't think there's any compulsion on the part of the Indian government to sort of force foreign manufacturing firms or foreign semiconductor firms to partner with an Indian entity. That's certainly something I don't see happening at all, because to be honest, there are not too many Indian companies which have capabilities in the fabrication part of the value chain. So I don't see why they would sort of partner. Even the case of PSMC in Tata's is more a case of tech transfer, from what I understand. It's not a case of joint equity investment. It's a case of tech transfer directly from PSMC to Tata's. So what would an Indian entity offer? Probably regulatory navigation, probably land acquisition issues, I think would be sorted out. A conglomerate like Tata has clearly got a century worth of experience operating in India. So that certainly helps. But I would say if you were to just go by the core technology component level, I don't know if Indian corporates or Indian companies, they don't invest that much in R&D to begin with. So I don't think, anybody will sort of be partnering with Indian companies on semiconductor because of the kind of tech they have to offer.
Well, thank you. So in the last 5 minutes or so, I'd like to invite any of our panelists to give us some closing thoughts. Otherwise, I can wrap up. But please, Jason, Philip, Konark, if you'd like to talk, please go ahead. Give us some parting wisdom.
Maybe I could start. As we think about what to invest, you mentioned that instead of advanced node, we look at India, we look at the legacy node, the more mature nodes. And as a technologist, I would like to add a little bit of color to this term called mature node or technology or legacy node. We simply think of mature node technology as being older versions of the advanced node, that would be a big mistake. because certainly there's a market for that as well. That for the older generations of digital technology that is simply a descendant of the advanced node of years ago. But there's also a very vibrant market of derivative technologies. Sometimes people call it specialty technologies, sometimes to call it with some other names, but basically technologies that derive from the basic digital technology, but has different functions. For example, image sensor devices, memory devices, and other analog products and things like that. Those are actually not simply older generations of digital logic, but requires some significant efforts into developing it into a technology that serves specific purposes. And those could have, if one finds a market niche in those areas, it would be much more profitable, have a much higher profit margin than simply the older generations of the digital technology. I think that's an important piece, and that requires one to be astute about where the customers are, where the market will go, and what kind of specialized function one could impart onto the basic technology and morph that, evolve that into these special functions. So that's an important distinction of simply just mature node. The other aspect which we haven't talked about is power devices, compound semiconductors devices, gallium nitride, high power, high voltage devices. Those are clearly on the rise in terms of market, because of the broader use of solar and electric vehicles and other energy transformation related technologies. Those right now don't have a single dominant player or a few dominant players, as in memory devices or in logic devices and so on. In those cases, the markets are more splintered. And if one is able to capitalize on the fact that the market is splintered, then one may be able to gain some foothold in the marketplace in those kinds of markets.
Some young Indian entrepreneurs, if you're listening, you've just heard the secret recipe for where you might become a billionaire yourself. That's very helpful. Thank you, Dr. Wang, Professor Wang. Jason, would you like to impart some wisdom before we end?
No, I think India is really well positioned to be to capitalize on not only the technology but also the applications. I think I've seen a very vibrant talent sources and also eagerness to participate and to thrive in this sector. And again, I think government could focus on producing a environment that is attractive and also ecosystem oriented. And I think with India's vast resources, I think it's very likely that this could be successful.
That's very helpful. Some youthful optimism. Konark, anything to add?
Sure, I have just a brief thing. So Professor Wong spoke about a niche in the market which can probably be exploited. I think something which is not spoken about, and I know it's just an awkward time to bring this up at the very end, but it's sort of something which gets overlooked, is security and trust. So cyber resiliency, or the ability to work in a trusted way with partner nations, I think is something which is going to be important. A lot of people are looking to source chips from people or companies or jurisdictions which don't have backdoors built in, to put it that way. I think this is an issue which has the potential to be an accelerator and a differentiator for the Indian companies, or for India at least. India finds itself sort of at a position now where supply chains are rebalancing and moving away from China. Can it capitalize as a position or as a a destination which focuses on secure and trustworthy chips? It remains to be seen, but I think that's a niche which India can possibly exploit.
That's really helpful. It sounds like, on the whole, on balance, we've got a lot of optimism here, especially given India's sad track record, honestly sad track record, from the 60s to 2010s. Government's going to have to not just invest, but invest smarter. That's one of my big takeaways. There are amazing changes that are taking place in the industry. India has to position itself in an intelligent way to differentiate itself from other countries that are pursuing this, and perhaps focus on other areas than where it's currently focusing. And then the area that really has gotten me excited from this conversation is the talent sharing possibilities between India and Taiwan. It seems like there's something really robust there. This has been a really insightful discussion. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Carnegie India for organizing this. I've learned a lot. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.